My boss tried to force me to work overtime without pay, and the very next day he regretted it. This story is pretty long. It happened when I worked at a casino. If anyone thinks it's a glamorous job, let me tell you right off the bat, it's not as pretty as it looks from the outside, especially if you're working in the kitchen. First, a bit of backstory so you understand the context. When I started there, I was still pretty young, studying in college, and juggling two part-time jobs. At first, it was manageable. They hired me as a steward, which is just a fancy word for dishwasher. The work wasn't too tough since I'd done the same thing at my previous job. But there were some differences. I won't go into all the details, just the ones relevant to the story. The first thing I liked most was that the casino had a lot of restaurants, and all the stewards were in one department, rotating daily between locations. One day you're in the steakhouse, the next in the buffet, then the Italian restaurant, then the sandwich bar in the bingo hall, and so on. This meant constantly meeting new people and changing scenery. People told me it was weird that I enjoyed that, but I'd say, if you end up working with some jerk, you won't be stuck with them tomorrow, so you don't have to put up with it for long. The second thing was that management absolutely hated unions. Twice a year, we had mandatory meetings where they go on about how unions are bad and manipulate workers. Anti-union posters were plastered all over the hallways. After working there for a while, my boss asked if I wanted to switch from part-time to full-time. I agreed because the perks were really good. Besides medical and dental insurance, I got access to the company's lawyers and some other bonuses. Good thing I said yes, because a few months later, some major changes hit. I don't know what sparked it, but almost everyone hated the new rules. First, they scrapped the sick leave policy. If you got sick, they didn't care if you had a doctor's note proving you couldn't work. If you didn't show up, you got a penalty point. Because of this, cooks and stewards came to work sick, puking into trash cans, because they couldn't afford the penalty since it affected their pay and chances for a raise. Another change was cutting the number of full-time staff. Me and the others who already had that status were safe, but if one of us quit, they wouldn't replace us. In the end, each department was left with a max of 2 full-timers. Oh, and speaking of departments, another big change was that our steward department was officially dissolved. Our direct supervisor stayed, but now the chefs and restaurant managers were in charge of us. This meant we no longer rotated locations and got stuck in one spot. They sent me to the steakhouse, and luckily, I had 2 awesome co-workers. We clicked so well they nicknamed us the Triple A's. Since all 3 of our names started with A, working there, I started thinking about career growth in the casino. I knew it'd be tough, but I had a dream of buying my family's countryside cottage from my parents and living there until I finished college. Unfortunately, my first shot at becoming a supervisor flopped, and I ended up training the guy who got the job. I didn't complain, just took it as a sign I needed to work harder on myself. Now the actual story begins. Our head chef got transferred to the Italian restaurant, and his assistant was supposed to take his place. So, they needed to hire someone new for the assistant chef's spot. They brought in this guy. Let's call him Kevin. When Kevin first started, he seemed fine. Not great, not terrible, just a regular dude. We didn't even have much reason to talk since we were usually too busy. About a month after he arrived, I had my first real run-in with him, and it was something else. It was evening, which meant the dinner rush was coming. I told my coworkers I'd go refill my water bottle before it got crazy, and they all agreed and said they'd do the same after I got back. But before I could even leave the steakhouse for the break room, Kevin called out to me. "Hey, where are you going?" "Gonna grab some water before the rush," I said. "I told the girls." "Then why aren't you using the waitstaff's fountain?" I blinked, confused. "When we were hired, They told us employees can only get drinks in the break room. Don't bullshit me. I see waitstaff grabbing water there all the time. You're just wasting time. I'll have to write you up. Wasting time? The break room's right down the hall. In the time we've been talking, I could have gone, gotten ice, filled my bottle, and been back. Kevin opened his mouth to reply, but then the chef noticed us and came over to see what was up. Before I could say anything, Kevin confidently told the chef the whole story. But his confidence quickly faded. Oh, I'll have to talk to the waitstaff manager about that again, he stammered. The chef said, You go fill your bottle. Kevin, we're talking privately now. So I did. I was totally baffled by what happened. At first, I was ready to believe Kevin genuinely didn't know the rules. Maybe he thought since cooks and managers could grab water from the waitstaff fountain, it applied to everyone. But later, when I talked to my coworkers, I found out he'd been the same way with them, nitpicking over little things, but usually just giving a warning and letting it go after they apologized. They figured he was just marking his territory, and maybe if I hadn't challenged his authority right away, he'd have gone easier on me. After that incident, I started noticing things. First, the waitstaff stopped talking to Kevin because they were pissed at him for hassling them. He also kept calling my female coworkers to help him with petty tasks like peeling potatoes, leaving me alone for hours. And every time I stopped to chat with one of my supervisors, a young woman, he'd yell at me to get back to work. I started suspecting he had ulterior motives, and those suspicions were confirmed that summer. For anyone who's never been in a professional kitchen, it can get hot, really hot in the summer. Sometimes the smells alone could knock you out. That day, I was in a huge sink, counting leftover perch and scrubbing greasy pans when Kevin suddenly called me to the office. It was weird because I only got called there for a 10-cent raise during performance reviews, and that wasn't due until January. Curious, I followed him to the small room. He gestured for me to go in first. I walked in and saw a woman I'd never met before sitting at a desk. She looked up from her work and gave me a questioning look, like, Hi, how can I help you? You know, that kind of glance. Then Kevin spoke, closing the door and backing into the room. You stink, he said to me. The woman's jaw dropped, and she glared at him furiously while Kevin flinched, clearly not expecting her to be there. Sorry, I misspoke. He backpedaled. I meant he smells bad. I've been getting complaints about his sweat. Like I said, the room was tiny, cramped with 3 people. I was standing close to the woman, who was visibly annoyed. I don't smell anything, she said. Mind if I get closer, young man? No problem, I said, letting her lean in and sniff me a couple of times. She pulled back. I don't smell anything. Then I spoke up. Look, if someone's saying I smell, I'm sorry, but I'm working over sinks with chemicals, cleaning greasy fish pans in like 90-degree heat. Plus, these aprons they give us aren't exactly top-notch. To prove my point, I gestured to my soaked, fish-covered work clothes. Got it, the woman said. I'll need to check those aprons and replace the worn-out ones. You, go take a break. Kevin, stay. We need to talk. 3 things happened after that. First, we stewards got new aprons, which we were all thrilled about since the old ones were falling apart. Second, from then on, if Kevin wanted to discuss something with me, another employee had to be present as a witness. If no one was around, I had to find that woman, who turned out to be the steakhouse manager. Third, an open war started between me and Kevin. He couldn't just pull me aside anymore, so he started publicly yelling at me over anything and everything. If he saw me waiting for the dishwasher to fill, he'd shout from across the room to get back to work, then go right back to chatting with the girls. He nitpicked every little thing just to ruin my day. I soon realized he saw me as an obstacle between him and all the female coworkers I got along with. I even felt like he thought I was some harem protagonist, given how many women I worked with. Over the next year, I did everything I could to stop him while still trying to land that supervisor role. I went to HR with written complaints, only to be met with, "And what do you want us to do about it?" When I talked to my direct supervisor, he just told me to grow thicker skin. It got worse every day. On top of that, my money got stolen twice. First, my bank account was drained, then my tax refund. The bank wouldn't help, and the casino's legal department dragged its feet. I was left broke for a long time, making things even worse. Some days, I collect empty cans from the break room just to scrape together gas money. I even had to give up one of my cats because of the constant stress Kevin piled on. I felt awful. Luckily, I still had good people around me. Some coworkers chipped in with small food bags, and a few cooks quietly slipped me meat they were going to toss anyway. Then came that day. It was the evening of one of the coldest days of the year. So cold that keys were snapping in locks because they'd frozen shut. I managed to get to my car, start it, and let it warm up for a couple of minutes before heading back to the locker room to enjoy my one remaining comfort, a book. I planned to read a few pages and then drive home. But before I could finish the first paragraph, the locker room door swung open, and Kevin walked in. He looked around, spotted me, and grinned a nasty grin. "Who said you could end your shift?" "Definitely not me. The night shift just complained the dishwasher's filthy. Obviously you didn't clean it. Go fix it right now, and if you dare clock in again, you're fired." With that, he walked out laughing. For a moment, I froze, wondering if he even had the authority to do that. Fear hit me hard. Losing this job would have been a disaster. I'd already dropped out of college due to my situation, was in debt to my parents for rent, and could barely afford to keep the one street cat I'd taken in. For the first time in years, I felt so anxious I could have cried. But then the fear gave way to rage. This guy had tormented me for too long. I didn't care if he was right or not. I was done. I decided I'd tell my parents everything, including the identity theft I'd hidden from them out of shame. I'd tried handling it on my own, but I'd had enough. I'd asked to move back home and get their help finding a new job. Sure, I'd have to give up my dream of owning the countryside cottage, but stability mattered more now. But before I could act, another thought popped into my head, and I couldn't help but smile. He wants me to clean the dishwasher right now, off the clock? Fine, I'll do it. I left the locker room, ignoring a security guard who called out to me and everyone else, mentally preparing for what was about to happen. When I got to the kitchen, there were mountains of dirty dishes, pots, pans, and utensils, like after a big concert night. I ignored that too, along with the 3 night shift stewards busting their butts unloading the dishwasher. "What are you doing here?" one asked. "Sorry, but Kevin said you complained to him that I didn't clean the machine, and it's a mess. So bad he made me come back and clean it right now, off the clock, or I'm fired." Their faces went pale. When the first one pulled himself together, he said none of them had seen Kevin, and the dishwasher was spotless when they started their shift. Hearing that, I felt guilty. My actions were slowing them down. While one went to get the night supervisor, the other 2 argued about whether Kevin even had the right to force overtime or fire me for refusing. It didn't help that the casino had a nasty habit of offering staff a room to crash in if roads were snowed over, then making them work all night. When the night supervisor arrived, she asked what was going on. As I kept cleaning the dishwasher, I told her the story. She said Kevin hadn't spoken to her and had already gone home, and he didn't have the authority to fire me anyway. I said I couldn't risk it, and asked how to submit a 2-week resignation. She was even more surprised and asked why I was bothering if I was quitting anyway. I said I needed time to prepare and wanted my last paycheck. I wrote the resignation, even listing the reason, and drove home. I got in at 3 a.m., exhausted from the stress, and collapsed into bed still in my work clothes. The next morning, I was woken by a call from the casino. The head steward supervisor asked me to come in and talk about last night's incident. At first, I refused. I didn't want to waste the trip, but he insisted it was important. Intrigued, I went. A couple of hours later, I was brought into the steakhouse office, packed with people. The night supervisor, night security guard, my supervisors, some senior cooks, and the steakhouse manager, whose face was practically glowing with anger as she glared at Kevin. He sat slumped over like a scolded kid in the corner. They told me they'd sorted it out. After our talk, the night supervisor checked the cameras and saw Kevin peek out the door, head to the locker room, and leave a few minutes later with a smug grin. They called him in early that morning. He tried lying, saying it never happened and I was framing him. They reminded him the guard was nearby and the footage was easy to check. Suddenly, he remembered talking to me but claimed I misunderstood, that he never told me to work off the clock. The supervisor and others asked him, "Why would he lie? Who told you the dishwasher was dirty? Why did he need your permission to leave?" Kevin kept stumbling over his story until he finally realized he was caught. The steakhouse manager apologized to me and asked if I'd stay. The other manager did too. At first, I was going to say no, but then a dumb thought hit me. Maybe if I stayed, I'd get that supervisor shot and wouldn't have to quit. So I said I'd stay, but only if Kevin never dealt with me directly again. If he had issues with my work, he'd have to go through the head chef unless it was an emergency. They agreed. Later, I heard a few theories about why management stepped in. The first, and least likely in my opinion, was that this incident finally got the attention of some higher-up who saw all my complaints about Kevin and demanded answers. The second was that they just didn't want to lose me. Remember how I said we used to rotate locations? Well, it turned out I was one of only 2 people left who knew the workflow in every restaurant. I could walk into any spot, know where everything was, and jump in without wasting anyone's time. But the most likely reason was the third, unions. Word of what happened spread through the casino way faster than I could have imagined, and management was scared that if they didn't act, union reps would jump on it. In the end, I stayed at the steakhouse longer than Kevin did. He quit 2 years later. Before he left, I promised everyone I'd throw a party the day after he was gone. Update: lots of questions came up, so I decided to clarify and answer most of them. First, the length of the text. Did anyone read my first sentence? I said right away it'd be long. Why complain when I warned you? For those who thought the first part was filler, I wanted to show the conditions my coworkers and I worked under and mentioned details that mattered later, like how being one of the few who knew all the restaurants helped me. Second, my car. Yes, I turned it off. Sorry, forgot to mention that. Third, legal stuff. Some asked why I didn't sue the casino or Kevin earlier. Honestly, I dreamed of it, but since the casino was on an Indian reservation, all legal matters went through the tribal council. It was well known that if an employee went up against the casino, they almost always lost. Plus, in my financial state, I couldn't afford a lawyer and didn't know what had happened if I lost. Fourth, why I put up with it so long. I thought about including this in the original post, but didn't want to overload it. Truth is, finding a decent paying job back then was brutal. I could have tried transferring departments, but I'd have to start from scratch, losing my full-time status and any shot at a raise, plus my medical and dental insurance. I admit, I was terrified of going without those for who knows how long. Fifth, Kevin's punishment. At the time, I was just glad something was done, even if I didn't see it. Some said I should have demanded his job. Problem is, it doesn't work that way. You can't just become an assistant chef without years of experience and training. I didn't even have enough qualifications to be a line cook. Sixth, the ending. Sorry it wasn't as dramatic as some wanted. In life, I've learned grand finales are rare. I've learned to savor small wins and move on. Sadly, I couldn't save that countryside cottage I dreamed of, though I did resolve the identity theft issue. I never got the supervisor role either. I gave up when they flat out told me I didn't get it because I followed the rules too strictly. That was the last straw. Still, life got 1,000 times better. By sticking it out in that hellhole, I met the love of my life. Shortly after that final promotion rejection, I started job hunting. Though I didn't get the countryside house, I now own a home with my wife. In the end, I found a comfortable life, and I consider that the best revenge.